The hospital room was eerily silent, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Miles Harrington stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him, a man who had everything, yet felt nothing. His hands trembled as he held the tiny bundle in his arms, the weight of the child both foreign and overwhelming. The baby's eyes were closed, its face peaceful, unaware of the storm raging around it. Miles couldn't tear his gaze away. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, the culmination of a carefully calculated plan. But as he looked down at the child, something inside him shifted. A soft sob broke the silence. Miles turned to see Grace lying in the hospital bed, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him, her expression a mix of pain and defiance. "You should have asked," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You should have asked the right questions." Miles frowned, his grip tightening around the baby. "What are you talking about?" Grace's lips quivered as she spoke. "He's not yours." The words hit Miles like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, his mind racing. Not his. How could that be? He had planned everything so meticulously, controlled every variable. This wasn't part of the deal, but as he looked at Grace, he saw the truth in her eyes. She hadn't lied. She had never said the child was his. He had simply assumed. The room spun around him, the beep of the monitor growing louder, more insistent. Miles felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, but beneath it all, something else. Something he couldn't name. The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the tinted windows of Miles Harrington's penthouse office. Outside, the city lights blurred into a mosaic of gold and grey, but Miles didn't notice. His gaze was fixed on the empty chair across from his desk, where countless business partners, rivals and sycophants had sat over the years. None of them mattered now. None of them could give him what he truly wanted. An heir. The word echoed in his mind like a taunt. At 42, Miles had everything: wealth, power, respect. His name was synonymous with success, his empire spanning continents, but it all felt hollow, empty. What was the point of building a legacy if there was no one to inherit it? He leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the room pressing in on him. His last relationship had ended months ago, another casualty of his cold, calculated nature. Love had never been his priority. Love was messy, unpredictable. Love was a liability. But now, staring at the storm outside, Miles felt the weight of his loneliness like a physical ache. He needed a solution, and he needed it fast. The next morning, Miles found himself in a part of the city he usually avoided. The streets were lined with crumbling buildings and flickering neon signs, a stark contrast to the polished world he inhabited. His driver, a silent man named Victor, pulled the car to a stop near a dimly lit alley. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Victor asked, his voice tinged with concern. Miles didn't answer. He stepped out of the car, his tailored coat shielding him from the drizzle, and walked toward the alley. There, huddled under a tattered blanket, was a woman. Her face was pale, her dark hair matted, but her eyes were sharp, defiant. Grace. Miles had seen her before, weeks ago, during one of his rare walks through the city. Something about her had stuck with him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself despite her circumstances. Maybe it was the faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Or maybe it was the small swell of her belly, barely noticeable under the blanket. She was pregnant. Miles crouched down, his polished shoes sinking into the wet pavement. "Grace," he said, his voice calm but commanding. She looked up, startled. "How do you know my name?" "I make it my business to know things," Miles replied. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to her. "I have a proposition for you." Grace hesitated, then took the card. Her hands trembled as she read the embossed letters. Miles Harrington, CEO of Harrington Enterprises. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, her voice wary. Miles studied her for a moment, weighing his words. "I need an heir, someone to carry on my name, my legacy. You're pregnant. I can give you a home, financial stability, a future. In return, you'll give me the child." Grace's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like she might laugh or cry. "You're serious." "Deadly serious," Miles said. "Think about it. No more cold nights on the streets. No more wondering where your next meal will come from. You'll want for nothing. Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers brushing against her stomach. Miles could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between pride and desperation. She began, then stopped. Her voice was barely a whisper. I need time to think. Miles nodded. You have until tomorrow. Same time, same place. He stood, brushing off his coat. Don't make me regret this. As he walked away, Grace clutched the business card tightly, her mind racing. She knew this was a deal with the devil. But what choice did she have? The next evening, Miles returned to the alley. Grace was waiting for him, her face pale but resolute. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady. But on one condition. Miles raised an eyebrow. And what's that? You don't ask questions, Grace said. About me, about the baby, about anything. Miles considered this for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. He extended his hand and Grace shook it, her grip firm despite the tremble in her fingers. As they walked to the waiting car, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The car ride to Miles's estate was silent, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Grace sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stared out the window, watching as the city's grime gave way to manicured lawns and towering gates. Miles glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She looked out of place in his world, her threadbare clothes and worn shoes, a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. But there was something about her, a quiet strength, a resilience that intrigued him. When they arrived at the estate, Grace's breath caught in her throat. The house was massive, a modern fortress of glass and steel. It was beautiful but cold, just like its owner. Miles led her inside, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. This will be your home for the next 9 months, he said, his tone businesslike. You'll have everything you need, food, clothing, medical care. But there are rules. Grace nodded, her eyes scanning the opulent surroundings. What kind of rules? You don't leave the property without my permission, Miles said. You don't speak to anyone about our arrangement. And you don't ask questions. Grace's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had agreed to this after all. Over the next few weeks, Grace settled into her new life, if it could be called that. She had a spacious room with a view of the gardens, a closet filled with clothes she would never have dreamed of owning, and meals prepared by a private chef. But it felt more like a gilded cage than a home. Miles was rarely around, consumed by his work. When he was home, he kept his distance, treating Grace with a cold politeness that made her skin crawl. She tried to make conversation once, asking about his day, but he shut her down with a curt, "That's none of your concern." Grace quickly learned to keep to herself. She spent her days reading, walking the gardens, and talking to the baby growing inside her. It was the only thing that kept her sane. One evening, as Grace sat by the fireplace in the living room, Miles walked in, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. He looked tired, more human than she had ever seen him. "You're still up," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace nodded. "I couldn't sleep." Miles hesitated, then sat down in the armchair across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire filled the silence. "Do you ever wonder," Grace began, her voice tentative, "what kind of parent you'll be?" Miles stiffened, his expression hardening. "That's not something you need to worry about." Grace looked down at her hands, her heart pounding. She wanted to push him, to make him see that this wasn't just a transaction, it was a life. But she knew better. She said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want the baby to be happy." Miles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "The baby will want for nothing," he said, his tone final. "That's all that matters." He walked out of the room, leaving Grace alone with the fire and her thoughts. As the weeks turned into months, Grace began to notice small changes in Miles. He started spending more time at home, often lingering in the same room as her, though they rarely spoke. Once she caught him watching her as she read, his expression unreadable. One night, Grace woke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. She sat up, her heart racing, and saw a shadow under the door. It lingered for a moment, then disappeared. The next morning, Miles was gone before she woke up. The days blurred together for Grace, marked only by the growing swell of her belly and the quiet rhythm of life in Miles's estate. She had settled into a routine, though it felt more like survival than living. The house was always silent, save for the occasional footsteps of the staff or the distant hum of Miles's car pulling into the driveway. Grace spent most of her time in the library, a room filled with books she had never heard of, but found herself drawn to. She read voraciously, losing herself in stories of love, loss, and redemption. It was easier than thinking about her own life, about the choices she had made and the future that loomed ahead. One afternoon, as she sat by the window with a book in her lap, she felt the baby kick for the first time. The sensation was so sudden, so real, that she gasped aloud. Tears welled in her eyes as she placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the tiny movements beneath her palm. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm here." For the first time in months, Grace felt a flicker of hope. Miles, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain his composure. The pregnancy was progressing, and with it came a strange, unsettling feeling he couldn't quite name. He found himself thinking about Grace more often than he cared to admit, her presence lingering in his mind, even when he was miles away. One evening, he returned home late from a business meeting, his mind buzzing with numbers and strategies. As he walked past the library, he saw Grace sitting by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. She was humming softly, her hand resting on her stomach. Miles paused, his breath catching in his throat. She looked peaceful, beautiful even. The realization startled him, and he quickly shook it off, retreating to his study before she could notice him. But the image stayed with him, haunting his thoughts long into the night. The next morning, Grace was surprised to find Miles in the dining room, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. He rarely ate breakfast at home, preferring to grab something on the go. "Good morning," she said cautiously, taking a seat across from him. Miles glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Morning." They ate in silence, the clink of silverware the only sound between them. Grace wanted to say something, to break the tension, but she didn't know where to start. Finally, Miles cleared his throat. "How are you feeling?" The question caught Grace off guard. "I'm fine," she said, hesitating. "The baby's been moving a lot lately." Miles nodded, his eyes flickering to her stomach before quickly looking away. "Good. That's good." Another silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Grace fidgeted with her napkin, searching for something to say. "Do you—" she began, then stopped. "Do you ever think about what kind of parent you'll be?" Miles stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I've told you before. That's not something you need to worry about." Grace bit her lip, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "But I do worry. This isn't just a business deal, Miles. This is a child. A person. Don't you care about that?" Miles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I care about providing for the child. That's all that matters." He walked out of the room, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and the cold remains of breakfast. As the weeks passed, Grace began to notice small changes in Miles. He started spending more time at home, often lingering in the same room as her, though they rarely spoke. Once she caught him watching her as she read, his expression unreadable. One night, Grace woke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. She sat up, her heart racing, and saw a shadow under the door. It lingered for a moment, then disappeared. The next morning, Miles was gone before she woke up. The tension between them grew, a silent battle of wills that neither was willing to acknowledge. Grace tried to focus on the baby, on the tiny life growing inside her, but it was hard to ignore the man who loomed over her like a shadow. One evening, as she sat in the garden watching the sunset, Miles joined her. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his hands in his pockets, staring at the horizon. "It's beautiful," Grace said softly, breaking the silence. Miles nodded. "It is." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, Miles turned to her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Grace," he began, his voice hesitant. But before he could finish, his phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen, his face hardening. "I have to take this," he said, walking away without another word. Grace watched him go, her heart aching with a strange, inexplicable sadness. The hospital room was bathed in sterile white light, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of antiseptic. Grace lay in the bed, her face pale and glistening with sweat, her hands gripping the sheets as another contraction ripped through her. The pain was unbearable, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to cry out. Miles stood by the window, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists. He had been silent since they arrived, his face a mask of stoic indifference. But inside he was a storm of emotions, fear, anticipation, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Push, Grace," the doctor said, her voice calm but firm. "You're almost there." Grace nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She closed her eyes and focused all her strength, all her will on bringing this child into the world. And then, with a final agonizing push, it was over. The room filled with the sound of a baby's cry, sharp and piercing, a sound that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. Grace slumped back against the pillows, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. "It's a boy," the doctor said, smiling as she handed the baby to Grace. Grace took the child in her arms, her hands trembling as she cradled him close. He was so small, so perfect, his tiny face scrunched up in a cry that melted into a soft whimper as he felt her warmth. "Hello," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hello, my sweet boy." Miles turned from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been prepared for this moment, or so he thought. But as he looked at Grace holding the baby, something inside him shifted. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the child. "Can I—" he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Grace looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment she hesitated, then nodded. Miles reached out, his hands trembling slightly as he took the baby from her. The child felt impossibly small in his arms, his warmth seeping into Miles's skin. He stared down at the tiny face, the button nose, the tuft of dark hair, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a connection deep and primal that took his breath away. Miles began, but the words caught in his throat. Grace watched him, her heart aching with a strange mix of emotions. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. And then Miles looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "Grace," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Is he—" Grace's breath hitched, her chest tightening. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it, but now that it was here, she felt a strange sense of relief. "Miles," she said, her voice trembling, "he's not yours." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Miles stared at her, his mind reeling. "What?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze. "I never lied to you. I never said he was yours. You just assumed." Miles felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He looked down at the baby in his arms, his heart pounding. But why? Why would you agree to this if— "Because I had no choice," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I was desperate. I needed to give him a better life. And you offered that. But I never intended to deceive you." Miles staggered back, his mind racing. He had been so sure, so confident in his plan, but now everything was falling apart. The baby began to cry, his tiny fists flailing, and Miles instinctively pulled him closer, his arms tightening around the child. He looked down at the boy, his heart aching with a strange, unfamiliar pain. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "That's up to you," she said. "You can walk away. Or you can stay." Miles looked at her, then down at the baby, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The rain fell softly outside the hospital window, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding in Grace's head. She lay in the bed, her body exhausted but her mind racing. Miles had left the room after her revelation, his face a mask of shock and anger. She didn't blame him. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it, but now that it was here, she felt a strange sense of relief. As she stared at the ceiling, her thoughts drifted back to the past, to the life she had left behind. It had been a year ago, on a warm summer evening, when Grace had met Daniel. He was a musician, a dreamer with a guitar and a smile that could light up a room. They had fallen in love quickly, passionately, their connection as natural as the sunrise. For a while, life was perfect. They lived in a small apartment above a cafe, where Daniel played gigs on weekends and Grace worked as a waitress. They talked about the future, about starting a family, about growing old together. But then everything changed. Daniel had been on his way home from a late-night performance when the accident happened. A drunk driver ran a red light, and Daniel's motorcycle was no match for the speeding car. He died instantly. Grace's world shattered. She lost her job, her home, and eventually her will to keep going. The streets became her refuge, a place where she could disappear, where the pain couldn't find her. And then she found out she was pregnant. Grace's hand instinctively went to her stomach, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of her hospital gown. She'd been terrified when she first realized she was carrying Daniel's child. How could she raise a baby alone with nothing to her name? But as the weeks passed, she felt a growing determination. This child was all she had left of Daniel, a piece of him that would live on. She would do whatever it took to give him a better life. That's when Miles had found her. Grace closed her eyes, remembering the day he had approached her in the alley. She had been wary at first, suspicious of his motives. But his offer, a home, financial stability, a future for her child, had been impossible to refuse. She had known it was a risk, that she was making a deal with the devil. But what choice did she have? Back in the hospital room, Grace turned her head to look at the bassinet beside her bed. The baby was sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his soft cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do." The door opened and Miles walked in, his face unreadable. He stood by the bed, his eyes fixed on the baby. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice low. Grace looked up at him, surprised. "What?" "The father," Miles said. "Tell me about him." Grace hesitated, then nodded. She told him about Daniel, about their love, their dreams, and the tragedy that had torn them apart. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her chest, as if sharing her story could somehow make it easier to bear. Miles listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he looked down at the baby, his eyes filled with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. "He's lucky," Miles said finally, "to have a mother who loves him so much." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that. Miles turned to leave, but Grace reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "Miles," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment, before he walked out of the room. Miles stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights stretching out before him like a sea of stars. The cool night air did little to calm the storm raging inside him. He had always prided himself on his control, his ability to make decisions with cold, calculated precision. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt utterly lost. The baby wasn't his. The words echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of his arrogance, his blindness. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his plan. But now, everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. He thought about Grace, about the pain in her eyes when she told him the truth. He thought about the baby, about the way he had felt holding him in his arms, a connection so deep, so primal, that it had shaken him to his core. And he thought about himself, about the life he had built, the walls he had erected to keep the world at bay. For years he had told himself that he didn't need anyone, that love was a weakness. But now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Miles returned to the hospital. He found Grace sitting by the window, the baby cradled in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. "Miles," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the baby. "How is he?" "He's perfect," Grace said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Do you want to hold him?" Miles hesitated, then nodded. Grace carefully handed the baby to him, her hands brushing against his for a brief moment. The child stirred, his tiny fingers curling around Miles's thumb. Miles felt a lump form in his throat as he looked down at the boy, his heart aching with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. "What's his name?" Miles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace hesitated, then said, "Daniel, after his father." Miles nodded, his chest tightening. He had always thought of the baby as an abstract concept, a means to an end, but now, holding him in his arms, he realized how wrong he had been. This wasn't just a child. This was a person, a life, a future. Later that day, Miles sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He had always turned to work in times of stress, burying himself in numbers and strategies until the world made sense again. But now even that escape eluded him. His mind kept drifting back to the hospital, to the baby, to Grace. He thought about the life he had planned, the legacy he had wanted to build, and he thought about the life he could have now, if he was brave enough to take it. But was he? Miles had spent his entire life running from vulnerability, from connection. Love had always been a liability, a weakness to be avoided at all costs. But now, he wasn't so sure. He thought about the way Grace had looked at him, the way she had trusted him with her story, with her child. He thought about the baby, about the way he had felt holding him in his arms. And for the first time in his life, Miles felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. That evening, Miles returned to the hospital. He found Grace sitting by the window, the baby asleep in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. "Miles," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Grace, he began, then stopped. He took a deep breath, then said, "I want to be a part of his life." Grace's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" Miles stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the baby. "I know he's not mine, but I want to be there for him, for both of you." Grace stared at him, her mind racing. She had never expected this, never dared to hope for it. "Miles," she said, her voice trembling. "So are you sure?" He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked down at the baby, then back at Miles. "Thank you," she whispered. Miles reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "No," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you." The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the city as Miles stood in the doorway of Grace's new apartment. It was modest compared to his penthouse, but it was filled with light and life, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment she had left behind. Grace was in the living room, sitting on the floor with Daniel, who was giggling as she tickled his tiny feet. The sound of his laughter filled the room, a melody that made Miles's heart ache in the best possible way. "He's getting so big," Miles said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Grace looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "He is, and he's been asking for you." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Asking? He's barely 3 months old." Grace laughed, a sound that made Miles' chest tighten. "Okay, maybe not asking, but he definitely misses you when you're not around." Miles walked over and crouched down beside them, his eyes fixed on Daniel. The baby looked up at him, his tiny face breaking into a gummy smile. "Hey, little guy," Miles said, his voice soft. He reached out, letting Daniel grab his finger with his tiny hand. Grace watched them, her heart swelling with emotion. It had been months since Miles had made his decision, and in that time, he had proven himself to be everything she had hoped for, and more. He was there for Daniel, for her, in ways she had never expected. But there was still something unspoken between them, a tension that neither had dared to address. Later that evening, after Daniel had been put to bed, Miles and Grace sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The air was warm, the kind of night that made you believe anything was possible. "Thank you," Grace said, breaking the silence. "For everything." Miles looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," Grace said, her voice trembling. "You've given us so much, more than I ever thought possible." Miles hesitated, then said, "I should be thanking you." Grace frowned. "Me? Why?" "Because you've given me something I didn't even know I was missing," Miles said, his voice low. "You've shown me what it means to love, to be loved. And He trailed off, his eyes searching hers. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miles," she whispered. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "Grace, But before he could finish, Daniel's cry echoed from inside the apartment, breaking the moment. Grace stood quickly, her face flushed. "I should go check on him," she said, her voice trembling. Miles nodded, his heart aching with a strange mix of emotions. Of course. The next morning, Miles returned to the apartment, his mind still reeling from the night before. He found Grace in the kitchen, making breakfast, while Daniel played in his high chair. "Hey," Miles said, his voice soft. Grace looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "Hey, hungry?" Miles nodded, though food was the last thing on his mind. He sat down at the table, his eyes fixed on Grace as she moved around the kitchen. "Grace," he said finally, his voice low, "we need to talk." Grace froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to face him, her expression wary. "About what?" Miles took a deep breath, then said, "About us." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat, her mind racing. "Miles, I love you," Miles said, his voice firm. "I love you, and I love Daniel, and I want us to be a family. A real family." Grace stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Miles, are you sure?" He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Grace felt a sob escape her lips as she crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him. Miles held her tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I love you too," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "I always have." The story ends with Miles, Grace, and Daniel sitting together at the breakfast table, the sun streaming through the windows. For the first time in his life, Miles felt truly at peace. Love, he realized, wasn't something that could be bought or bargained for. It was something that had to be earned, nurtured, and cherished. And for the first time, he was ready to do just that. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that love is priceless. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more emotional, unforgettable tales. Thank you for watching.